Okay, we are in the last section of chapter 2, which I'm calling part 4, physiological changes with aging. So I've just got some pictures of kids. I've got pictures of older runners. So let's talk about what happens as we get older. Well, first off, there is a reduction in VO2 max, and there's about a 10% reduction per decade. Maybe 5% per decade if we look at trained people over the time. So here's just some data, VO2 max. This is age over years. And this line represents a line for athletes, and this line represents the data for untrained subjects. And this may be less of a decline for athletes than untrained. And now they start at a higher point as well. So they have a little bit of an advantage that when they hit 50, their VO2 max is still higher than untrained subjects, so they have a greater capacity to do work. Yeah, okay, so sorry, why is this? What I was going to say is, but these are athletes that have trained over this period of time, not athletes who trained as a runner in college or an athlete in college, but then they leave college and university, and then they don't do anything. They'll jump quickly down to this untrained group of subjects. So there's no advantage to being a college athlete if you don't continue to exercise and train over your lifespan. So why are there changes with aging? Well, Noakes talks about the central governor model and how this might explain changes as we get older. It may be a reduced blood flow to the heart that's an issue. That is, our cardiac circulation starts to get worse, and we have less blood circulating around the heart, which we talked about before. That could be a signal to the brain to tell the muscles to start to shut down. It could be a reduced cardiac output as we get older. It could be due to decreased permissible mass of skeletal muscle that can be recruited. It could be reduction in skeletal muscle contractility. It's more of a muscle power type model, that the muscle itself actually just is not able to contract in the same way when we're older versus younger. But the central governor model sort of leads back to messages being sent to the brain as we get older that indicates the person can't work as hard. All right, we'll talk more about that as we go along. So muscular components explain some of the changes with aging. Muscle mass declines with aging, especially at ages greater than 50 to 60 years old. Muscle strength is somewhat maintained up until about age 50, but there's a 15% loss in strength per decade up to 70, and then a 30% loss per decade after 70. So the amount of muscle strength decreases quickly as we get older, which speaks to the importance of doing strength training for older athletes as well as older people in general. Having strength training in a routine for older individuals is good. Muscle mass peaks about age 24 and falls by about 10% to about 50 years old. Type 1 and 2 fibers are both lost. Type 1 do retain normal size, but type 2 are smaller, the fast twitch. Oxidative capacity decreases with age, but it is reversible with training. And I'll show some data in just a bit, that if you take someone who is 40 years old, 50 years old, and they start training, they will have a training response, and that's positive. And so it is good to talk with people. That's never too late to start training for an endurance event. The number of motor neurons decreases after 60, about 10% per decade. So just the connectivity, the way the nervous system is going to work changes with aging as well. And these all explain changes in VO2 max. Body composition changes with aging. Increased body fat with increased aging has a negative impact on VO2 because we're carrying inert weight. It's like if you did a VO2 max test and then I added a weighted vest on you, your VO2 max in terms of mLs per kg per minute would be worse simply because we added extra mass. And that was not contributing to rate of oxygen consumption. Training helps reduce increase in body fat, which is a good thing, but remember muscle mass is also decreasing. So again, as our masters athletes, anyone over 40 is typically considered masters, incorporating some strength training is probably pretty critical to their training program. Training changes. Well, this actually does account for changes in fitness over ages. And as I mentioned, if you stop training after being a college athlete, you're going to have decrements in fitness, and so you can't bank it. General reduction in training volume and intensity accounts for 28 and 35% respectively, and variance of VO2 max. That is, as we get older, as we leave college, university, we have to work jobs, we have families, and we have less opportunity to train volume or accumulated training, or even doing different intensities of exercise. And so this, by just having more social responsibilities as we get older and families responsibilities, we can have a change in VO2 max because of decrements in training. Well, which comes first, reduced training that leads to reduced VO2 max, or reduced VO2 max that leads to reduced training? Athletes who are generally better endurance athletes may have a reduced decrement in VO2 and reduced training as well. So stay active is the message throughout your lifespan. Here's some data, VO2 max on the y-axis, age on the x-axis. You can start looking at longevity over time, and the rate of decrease will be based upon whether or not you are active or not active. But what this is just, sort of morbid example, but if we start, at age 20, having a high VO2 max, and we have a decrement over time, when we hit this dashed line, that's the minimum VO2 necessary for independent life, or to be able to get up and move around, walk within your house, or even use stairs. If you can't have a VO2 max of that amount, which is about 5 mLs per kg per minute, your life is really not going to be very good. We know resting VO2 is 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. So you want to always have VO2 max greater than at least 3.5 so you can be active. Other changes with aging that are important in terms of run performance, which ultimately lead back to VO2, the capacity to absorb landing forces may change as we get older. The capacity to attenuate landing forces is probably a better way to say that, or really capacity to absorb impact energy. That says about the same thing. So as we get older, the capacity to withstand the shock of running does change. Interestingly, shoe industry has responded in some way, and there are shoes with more impact energy absorbing capability now than even 10 years ago, definitely 15, 20 years ago. And that might actually be helping the older athlete. This is just some biomechanics in terms of looking at impact forces. We can quantify the impact forces. We can look at impact forces over time. It's going to be over different age groups. The body has to manage the impact while also generating the right amount of force to generate the next stride. So this is just some of the biomechanics of running. With changes of aging, if we have a change in the capacity to absorb impact energy, do elite runners damage skeletal muscles in such a way that they cannot be competitive at an older age? So you look at athletes who are really competitive at a younger age. Can they sustain that over a long period of time, or does that damage accumulate in a way that you have a decrement in performance as you get older? Noakes hypothesizes that high volume and intensity can only be sustained for about 15 years. All right, this next graph is actually really interesting. So here we have years of running competitively, and this is age, okay, in years. So if you run for 15 years competitively as a 30-year-old right here, or as a 40-year-old run competitively for under 5 years. There's fewer dots up above this line here. And what he's illustrating is there's less people able to run competitively longer than 15 years. Under this line, lots of dots, meaning you can run competitively for a year, 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 14 years. But once you get to 15 years of trying to run competitively, it starts to get more of a challenge. This, I think, these data, this is 2000. And I think some of this has changed, and I would actually push this up a little bit higher. But the idea is, the concept is that you can probably only be competitive for a certain period of time, and then the damage that is accumulated does add up, and eventually you start to not being able to be competitive. And that's important to build into our training programs: appropriate rest, appropriate recovery, periodization of training, in order to have as long of a competitive period of time as possible, if that's what you're trying to do. If you're not trying to be competitive, then this doesn't matter. But if you're trying to be competitive, then you want to be able to have a long career and build your training program in a way to allow for recovery, so you can extend out the years that you can be competitive. And I'm seeing endurance athletes nowadays that are being competitive for long periods of time. But I also know that those athletes are very attuned to rest and recovery. Just some case studies. So, sometimes we have to fall back to anecdotes. And this is an anecdote that Noak tells, a story about Basil Davis, who's completed 122 marathons at the time that this book was written, and 34 comrades marathons. Remember, that's a double marathon, and 56 ultra marathons. That's anything longer than a marathon. So this is a pretty accomplished distance runner. And he kept a pretty accurate training log. And some of the things that he noted after looking at that training log over time is, after age 45, his marathon performance deteriorated at a fast rate. After age 50, he recorded that he always seemed stiff. In later years, he could not predict his marathon time based upon his 10K time. So there's a real divergence of performance, especially at the marathon level. All right, so here's some data from him. Here's training distances, kilometers per year. At a young age, he didn't do a lot, but in his mid-life here, he did actually a lot. Here's peak training for a year. This is volume. But then as he got older, less ability to sustain training volume. And then even, 64, something happened. Maybe he couldn't even train as an, injured, what have you. That's pretty typical of a lot of endurance athletes. So the questions become, does wear and tear accumulate over time? Is there a breakdown of elastic behavior of the lower extremity? Do we lose that ability to take advantage of elastic energy? We could look at the biomechanical model that Noakes talks about here, which is really the muscle power model that he talked about earlier in the chapter. Muscle contraction is important to maintain the tension on connective tissue. Is exhaustion at any age a simulation of aging? That's just an interesting question. Is hitting the wall a function of breaking down elastic tissue? So hitting the wall, a lot of marathon runners will use that phrase when they hit somewhere around 20, 21 miles of a 26.2 marathon. And for whatever reason, they just say hit a wall and they can't continue to run, or it's really difficult to run. And that may be a breakdown of elastic tissue over that 20 miles. The concept being here is that every step, every impact that the body experiences, it's doing micro damage, and that damage may accumulate over time. Well, that accumulation may happen over a marathon distance, or it may happen over years. Noakes hypothesizes that when shock absorbing mechanisms are damaged, the central governor will force the body to run at a slower pace to protect the muscles and joints. So now here's just another example of a governor as part of the central governor model, that maybe something about pain or something about shock absorbing capability is being sensed, and the brain is telling the person that they can't run any faster because of potential for injury. Again, this is a hypothesis, okay? It's not a law. It's a hypothesis. And we don't know of any governors that detect shock, but it is an interesting concept that may drive changes with performance over different ages. Here's just some more data from Basil Davis, and this is going also talking about the concept of being competitive over a period of time. What he has here is just running speed here and then different distances, 10K, half marathon, comrades, the double marathon or marathon, and then age here. And these are his data for 10K. And these are the age group world records for whatever age group he was in. These are not the same people. So these people may have been new runners up around age 55 to 60, but these are not the same runners who are running or winning age group world records back here at age 25 to 30. But he could never catch whoever was the world record holder, but it was always different people. So it's just an interesting concept in terms of how long you feel you can be competitive. These people may not have been competitive for that long, but they were competitive for the period that they did run. Basil was able to be competitive for a period of time here, but not as competitive as he got older. And it does change based upon what distance you look at. So decline in performance with aging may be due to accumulated miles. This is why recovery strategies are really important. And I would say this is pretty contemporary with looking at the variety of recovery modalities that can be used by runners, from compression to water, being in the water. There's compression garments, intermittent compression, massage guns and massage devices. Those are all designed with the concept of reducing the damage due to accumulated mileage. Some evidence of this from 2000, 20 marathon and ultra marathon performers. We looked at runners who accumulated more than 5,000 kilometers in racing, used a different muscle recruitment strategy than those who raced less. This goes back to speaking to Noakes's idea that you can be competitive for 15 years. And then maybe something starts to change after a certain amount of accumulated mileage. And that makes sense. And so if you're working with older athletes, you should build in appropriate rest and recovery to try to extend out their competitive career as much as possible. So recovery, the ability to recover from intense exercise, is impaired with aging. So the strategy used may change with different ages. Chronic orthopedic disabilities may happen over time. Runners do get injured. Are older runners more susceptible to injuries? That's something to keep in mind. The ability to adapt to training. Aging does not necessarily, not necessarily negatively influence adaptation to training. And that's an important message to get out there. And I mentioned this before. It's good to encourage people to be active, and any age is a good age to start running or biking or swimming. Volume and intensity may be reduced with aging, or the capacity to train with higher volumes or higher intensities may change, but your training response can still happen at any age. All right, so summary of changes with aging. There is a reduction in VO2 max. Could be due to muscular components, could be due to body composition, could be due to changes in training approach, could be due to capacity to absorb landing forces, could be due to recovery methods, it could be due to chronic orthopedic disabilities, or the ability to adapt to training. All right, and that's it for aging. So be active throughout your life, and that's a good thing. And if you're active throughout your life, you'll have a more enjoyable life as you reach older ages. Okay, thank you.